All right, why do we learn? What do we learn? And how do we learn? These are some of the questions I wanted to answer when I started this podcast. This is an audio and video show where I interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, I interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, I hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest on the show. Today's guest is someone I'm super excited to interview, Utsav Mamoria. He's someone whose work I've consumed and engaged with on the internet for about 2 to 3 years now. I've never met him, but he almost seems like a friend. So, a little bit about Utsav before we jump into this conversation. So Utsav is a behavior researcher by training and a slow traveler by passion. This is something I picked up from his podcast, and I love this introduction. So he has built a successful career in the space of consumer insights and market research, but he dons many hats. He's a podcaster, a YouTuber, and a long form writer. He's also learning how to sketch, practice origami, and mentor 100 plus people towards starting their own content journeys. He has learned all this in the last 15 years while holding a full time job. His principle of learning, which I also am going to adopt, is to err is divine. I've been a listener of his podcasts, Postcards from Nowhere, for quite some time now. I highly recommend it. And in the show notes, I will also be including links to Utsav's podcast, Utsav's company that he's recently, I mean, it's been a while since he started. And I can also link Utsav on LinkedIn. So you can follow up this conversation by talking to him on those platforms. But Postcards from Nowhere is this amazing podcast where he condenses 10 years of travel to places like Armenia, Uzbekistan, and China. And his philosophy on travel is slow travel, which hopefully he'll be able to tell us a little bit about today. So Utsav, thank you so much for making time for this. I was so excited. You're one of my podcasting, heroes in India. And as a
So
fan
kind.
of as a fan of the ecosystem, I'm really excited to, chat with you today. But before we jump into your journey, which I think is beautifully unconventional, I'd love to know a little bit about your childhood, stories from your childhood. Where did you grow up? What were some of the things Utsav was curious about when he was a child? And were there any influences that you picked up from your parents growing up as well?
Uh, Thank you, Abhishek, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. Uh, of my childhood, I grew up in a very small town in India. It's a place called Anand in Gujarat. And what happened there was I was very fortunate to go to a very good school. It was a school which was funded partly by the National Dairy Development Board, the Amul as a brand, and so on, and a couple of other bodies as well. And that I think was one of my most formative and transformative experiences, going to a very very elite school in that sense, in a very very small town. Like, I think when I now speak to people and I compare the standard of education people have had in other cities, which larger cities, and traditionally much better schools, I feel that I think I was head and shoulders above them, just in the terms of exposure I got. I mean, for the fact that we had a library which was already stocking thousands of books back, and I'm talking about this is the mid 90s, right? In such a small place in itself was an absolute delight, because while we took it for granted that we just assumed we would know any better that not all schools have such great libraries, right? So that was, I think, one of the biggest advantages growing up, having great teachers and having a great library. The other thing also which I feel was an advantage is, when you come from a smaller place, I feel it drives you more, in the sense that at some point you realize, oh, there's a very big world out there which I am not really looking at. But and that just makes you want to go out and see the world and understand it, make sense of it, explore it in every way possible. And I think a lot of people don't realize the value of having this kind of an opportunity, because you have the mindset of saying that I'm missing out on so much in a good way, not in a way of saying that I'm missing out on all the random other things that are happening. So I feel those two are very, very formative for me in terms of how they shaped me, and how I think I started looking also at the world, because when I joined engineering for my bachelor's, I realized that I had read a lot more books than other people. Not because I am some great person or anything. It's just that I had just had more access, simply, right? And I had also had the privilege to be afforded free time by my parents to develop this, because both my parents are academics. Both of them hold PhDs. So I grew up with more books than furniture in our household, right? So it was very common for me to see that there are cupboards upon cupboards filled with books.
Mm.
So I think that also gave me a sense of this is normal. Like, it wasn't something which was off, because my parents both read, my sister read, I read, everybody around me was reading. So it was such a natural thing for me. And only when I got to college, I realized, oh, this is not the normal experience for a lot of people. So I think those few things really, stand out for me when I think of my child.
Very interesting, Utsav. I was curious about your educational journey. I think growing up in the 90s or, in the early 2000s, a lot of young people were encouraged to maybe take up a particular path aligned with. So if you had science, you were an engineer. If you had commerce, you were an accountant. If you had arts, you may pursue the law. So what was your thinking with regards to choosing engineering? And, eventually I know you also took up a degree in media and marketing after your engineering degree. So, what was going on in your head at that point of time in terms of the career you eventually wanted to dedicate your life to?
So I think engineering was not a conscious choice in any way. I actually wanted to pursue medicine, but so when I was in a place like Gujarat, you had the option to pursue both in your 11th and 12th. So I had both math and biology as my subjects, but I missed the cutoffs by a bit, so I could not make it to medicine. And I said, okay, the next best option is to pick up engineering. So I enrolled in an engineering course. I don't think it was a conscious decision by any means. And I also feel that this is something important to say, that the first few years of your adult life, you are really stumbling. Like, you're just trying to figure things out, right? And there's no clean script. I feel very few people have that very linear, clean journeys. I think it's a journey of trying to figure out who you are, because I think within the first 6 months of the program, I realized this is not for me.
Mm,
I think from an education standpoint, from a conventional education standpoint, I think it wasn't a good choice for me. But the advantage of going to an NIT, a National Institute of Technology, was that it had representation of people from all across India, right? So we used to have person from every single state, which means I had a batchmate from Andaman and Nicobar Islands as well, right? Now, that kind of a microcosm as an exposure was one of the best educations I think I've got, because not only it helped me understand the country, but it also helped me understand the realities of India beyond the privilege I had. So
mm,
while I did not have necessarily financial privilege, but I think I had a lot of social privilege in terms of having access to a good education, being able to speak English, because I studied English in English medium schools throughout, and the ability to have access to books to improve your reading and vocabulary and the way you speak. Whereas I also encountered so many of my batchmates who had come from very underprivileged backgrounds. Now, those could be caste backgrounds, those could be economic backgrounds, and so on. And I think that was a very, very humbling experience, because I think you start realizing a little bit of your privilege then. Till then, you do not, because everybody around you is privileged, so you assume that is the norm. And then you end up at a place like this, and you have someone whose parents are, daily wage laborers, right, coming in to study with you. I think it somewhere starts grounding you. I wouldn't say that I was some super grounded person when I came out of engineering, but I think there was a realization of my privilege then. And again, best part about going to college is there's just tons of free time. So I think I utilized it to the hilt. I watched a bunch of movies. I read so much. I participated in literary and debating things. Right, traveled a bit here and there close by. So I think overall it was a fantastic experience. Gave me friends for a lifetime. Um, so that was amazing. And around that time is when I started freelancing with the Times of India. It was in third year. They used to have a supplement called Surat Times, NIT. I went to National Institute of Technology in Surat, in Gujarat, and that's when I started writing for them, like on the campus beat, basically what's happening around campuses and what's happening and so on. And that was my first paycheck in that sense, right? I used to get paid per article, uh, and that felt nice. That gave me exposure to journalism in the sense that writing, having simple conversations with people, writing basic stuff, and I started getting interested more in the business side of media, right? So I said, okay, there's content, but there is a whole business side, and how does this business run, and so on. And with this basic sort of curiosity, I landed up at a communication school in Ahmedabad called Micah. And I think that was again a very pivotal moment in my career journey, in the sense that I think it's one of the things I really love about Micah is the diversity of people I got to see,
Mm.
purely in terms of backgrounds, because I had studied with engineers all my life, and then I suddenly land up in a school where at least half of the people are not engineers, right? And they have such varied viewpoints, they have such a different way of looking at the world, which was very refreshing. At the same time, I not only got a grounding in business and marketing, but I also got a grounding in social sciences.
Mm.
Right, so we had courses on film studies, on imagining India. We studied caste, class, race, gender as subjects, right? And I feel that also shaped my worldview significantly, because you become a lot more aware of the country which you don't see, and the country, or the I would rather say, or the exploitation and the injustice which is invisible to you thanks to your privilege. And I feel that also helped me, and thanks to again Micah, we saw a ton of films. I saw films from Iran, from Japan, from Brazil, from India, from Indian films in different languages, America, UK, and I think uh, just that that diversity of being exposed to a whole bunch of things gave me a very very good understanding of how to look at people and how to look at cultures.
Mm.
And I was majoring in market research because uh, consumer psychology, human psychology was always of interest to me. And I felt that, okay, maybe this is what I can do, right? And maybe try and make a living of it. So, yeah, that is how the whole thing started. I majored in, sort of media and marketing with market research as my major. And I landed up working with what is now known as Kantar, is a market research firm globally, and I was working specifically for the media business. Right, so I think I was fortunate that I was able to get that opportunity, and that's how my sort of education moved me to my career space.
Amazing, because you had like such a strong foundation in the sciences and social sciences, which I think is a amazing combination because you get to see perspectives from both these worlds. And I think with your engineering and your media and marketing degree, you had that foundation. And I remember in another podcast, the Seen and Unseen podcast, you mentioned a colleague of yours at university who had read so many books when he was at university. And
Yes.
I was thinking about that conversation. It's like some of these unstructured learning experiences where you meet people. And I think this is something I've also learned from your podcast. It's, like when you slow travel, sometimes when you speak to another person, you are also engaging in a form of travel. You are traveling through their experiences, their ways of looking at the world. But your job as a behavior researcher, a market researcher, there are lots of young people that would be interested in maybe taking up a career in this space itself. So I have two questions for you. Since 2010, you've been working for a variety of different companies in a variety of different spaces. So what does a behavior researcher do? Number one. And in the last 10 to 15 years, how has the Indian consumer evolved and changed based on your insights and experience?
So, for someone looking at a career in consumer or behavior research, my first advice to them would be please join this only if you are genuinely interested in people, culture, or psychology. Because otherwise, it's not the greatest paying job. I want to state that upfront. Whether you start or wherever you end, I think you start seeing some real money only 10 plus years after you have been in the industry. And by then, by the way, if you are considering, your peers might have moved far ahead. So it has to give you some amount of intrinsic joy to be able to be in the space. And as much as I've loved being in the space, I would not want to get anyone just for saying that, oh yes, please come, this is great. No, it is great, but it has to be great for you before because there is a money aspect to it which you want to think about. At the same time, I always have believed that if you enjoy something, you have to make a long term bet on it.
Mm,
Right? It is very, very important to make long term bet on things you enjoy, because otherwise, you will always maximize for the short term.
mm,
And maximizing for the short term would mean letting go of be having an ability to go deep into something and unlocking things which you can only do after you have spent certain amount of time in a certain field. Uh, so that would be my first piece of advice for someone looking into it. Now, how does a career in this space look like, or how does a day-to-day work sort of thing looks like? So, at a very crude level, if I may say, it's divided into qualitative and quantitative research. So, qualitative research focuses on going deep on understanding why do people do things they do, whereas quantitative research is more structured. What you traditionally understand as surveys is a way to, of course, quantify some of those behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. And irrespective of what the outcome of the qual or the quant research is, it is ultimately used to help a company or a brand take a decision,
mm,
right? Most likely a marketing or a product decision is what they are looking to take. This is I'm talking about market research on the corporate side of things.
right.
Right? So that is the that is what it at its core is supposed to do. It is supposed to help them take an informed decision, keeping the consumer at the center of things, and thereby benefit the business in the short, medium, or long term, depending on what kind of a uh, bet it is. Your day-to-day work could vary between trying to draft discussion guides in qualitative interviews, to drafting questionnaires, to analyzing data, to sometimes even cleaning data, to something as mundane as raising invoices, because that is also part of a job. But I feel the high points of the job, apart from discovering something new, is also trying to present a coherent set of insights and findings to a client and linking it back to their business.
Mm,
Uh, that I feel is a very underrated part of the job. It is also one of the hardest parts of the job, because trying to make sense of data, trying to put it together to tell a story, and put together a coherent picture of the consumer into whom the brand or the company is interested is a hard task. Uh, but it is also the most rewarding part of the job. Typically, people do this for a few years. Some choose to be into this, what we call the agency side of things, where you have clients and you do work for them because of various reasons. The top one, at least, which was for me for the longest time, was to just work on a sheer diversity of things.
mm,
Because, at one point I'm working for an FMCG brand, and then I'm working for something in insurance, and this gives you a very wide exposure to the different kinds of businesses out there. So, the other side of it is when you move over to the advertiser brand client side, right, where you decide what research needs to be done, how is that research going to be used, and then you commission work to agencies
mm,
who will actually carry out the work for you. Of course, this is I'm saying it at a very, very broad level. There are a lot of things which go uh, into it. Quantitative research, of course, has gone way beyond surveys. Right, today we have analytics, we have social listening. There's so much happening within this space. So that is what a day-to-day job in market research or consumer insights, looks like.
Got it. And like about the Indian consumer itself, like with the advent of social media, we have a lot of internet companies. I think after 2015, we sort of had this huge startup boom in the country, and we have an app for almost everything. So, do you think that that has changed consumer behavior? Like right now, if I want something in 10 minutes, I can get like my grocery. And I was speaking to some of my friends in the West, and they told me that they had recently visited and they were really surprised and shocked that we had such good data. Number one, like internet is so accessible and cheap, and number two, you have certain services, you using technology like that can have actually in a odd sort of way improved your quality of life, at least in the tier 1 cities. So how has that changed consumer behavior, because you've basically built your career in this same period where this boom was happening?
So I feel that one of the things we should understand about a country like India, that there are many Indias at any point in time.
Yeah.
So of course, the biggest beneficiaries of the internet boom is people like you and me who come from a certain amount of privilege.
Yeah.
Uh, right? So the fact that we are recording this over the internet is something which would not have been possible maybe 15 years ago, with as much ease as we are doing so today. So I feel with any technological innovation, the people who have the ability to control its mechanics and economics are the people who benefit the most.
Hmm.
So and then after that is when the adoption starts by people who are not as privileged. So because it's the privileged people who can who consume this, their life has changed dramatically. There's no question about it. Consumers are a lot more demanding today.
Hmm.
Consumers have so many choices that it doesn't take a lot for us to switch a brand if we are unhappy with an experience, and so on and so forth. And also, it's about 40-50 million consumers in India who drive a ton of consumption,
Yeah.
which is why if you see most of the brands who are startups who are trying to go public, so many of them are actually built on those 40-50 million people,
Correct. Yeah.
right? The top 5% of Zomato's customers drive 44% of revenue on the platform.
Hmm.
So that is a kind of disproportionate impact I am talking about. What the internet has done, I feel, for the second and third and fourth rung of people in terms of both economic and social privilege, is that it has democratized access to some products and services for sure.
Hmm.
For example, there is a gig economy in place today in a country like India, everything from doing delivery drivers to people coming and providing at-home salon services. So a lot of these people have now also been able to, come up and participate in a more formal economy because most of India's economy is informal.
Correct.
So participate in a more formal economy, but again, that has its pros and cons in the sense that essentially what technology does while it democratizes things is that sometimes it also simply replicates the power structures which already existed,
Hmm.
right? So today, if there is a set of delivery drivers who work with the food tech platform, yes, they have opportunity, but they're also open to exploitation because they are no longer employees, they're no longer contracts. So as with everything, every piece of change which comes, it comes with pros and cons. And I think it's important to understand that while it provides a lot of opportunity to people, it also takes away some agency from them.
Hmm.
Uh, but I in net, I would say definitely the access to cheap internet has been a net positive for India, and for the opportunities it creates. But I think how much of it is a net positive varies vastly by who you ask this question to and of.
Hmm. Very, very true, and very insightful itself, because I feel like we inhabit many Indias within our own worlds too. For instance, my family immigrated from the south to Mumbai, and we have my feet in two states, Maharashtra and Karnataka, and I've also stayed abroad for a while. So my version of India, or my way of looking at India, is very different from maybe someone that has a very different experience living in different states, and also language diversity, which is so rare, because we have, if you basically move to another state, you have different cuisines, different languages coming up. And this was one of the reflections I had from another podcast that you had mentioned, where how language can become something we really need to preserve. Because there was a story you mentioned again in the Seen and Unseen podcast, where the grandparents and the grandchildren were not able to communicate because the grandchildren spoke another language. And when you said that, I was really able to relate to that itself, because I actually speak a language called Tulu, which is a language from Karnataka that doesn't have a written script. So my grandmother was very proficient in Tulu, and my Tulu is conversational because I didn't speak it a lot growing up. And my fear for a long time when I was communicating with my grandparents was I would not be able to communicate with them if I don't speak Tulu or learn to speak it. And that was my sort of drive, and I think so many wonderful stories that you actually access from travel, now that we've learned so much about your career, Utsav, and I wanted to talk to you about travel. Your philosophy on travel, I feel, is very unique, because very often when people look at travel, it's almost like a checklist. I have to go to the big cities of the world, Paris, New York, Delhi or whatever, and check out all the big monuments, try the best food. But listening to you and listening to your podcast, for the last couple of years, I just feel like the way you look at travel is not very common. So, can you tell me about some of the trips that you have taken over the last 10 years, and how have these trips shaped your philosophy of learning, or what have you learned from travel in your life itself?
So I think uh, the most important uh, thing I've learned from travel is all travel, and I would like to extend it to the realm of art, is uh, is an exercise in self exploration.
Hmm.
Because when you go to a certain place and you like something, it's telling you more about yourself than it is actually about the thing.
Hmm.
Because there is something in that which appeals to you. Like, for example, for me, architecture is something which I'm very interested in. And when I go and see the Duomo in Florence, uh, and when I hear the story of how the architect came up with the design of a double shaped dome, which was something very unique for the time, it immediately captures my imagination. And when I think of it, that why does it capture my imagination? Because it was an architectural wonder for the time. Now, if you do not know this story, the Duomo is still beautiful, by the way. It doesn't matter whether you know the story or not. But the layer of meaning it adds to me personally, right, is that because when now the reason I'm talking about it, I took this trip in 2019. I am still talking about it because it was it is probably one of my favorite monuments in the world, and one of the reasons is the story of how it was actually built. And for I think almost a decade or two, nobody could build the dome because they realized we don't know how to build a dome of this size anymore because it wasn't possible by then. So every time you go and travel and observe something and you respond to it is actually telling you something about yourself.
Hmm.
I think that has been one of my biggest learnings, because instead of using travel as a consumption activity, I've also been able to use it as a reflection activity.
Okay.
I have been able to reflect upon what catches my attention, what am I interested in, why does this interest me, and then over time, as I keep traveling, I start seeing patterns on specific things which keep popping up for me. Right. So that in itself has been one great learning, because it changed the way how I traveled. It My travel was no longer about going to place A and just trying to see the highlights.
Hmm.
For me, it became about why has this place become what it is today? How did that happen? What were the main forces that shaped it, whether it's economic or social or cultural or climate or whatever it is? And once you start asking those questions, you first realize what are the questions which are interesting to you. And once you get the answers to those questions, you have such a richer understanding of the place itself.
Hmm.
So, when you ask people who are born and brought up in certain cities, right, they always associate some emotions or feelings with the city
Hmm.
because they believe that that is the spirit of the city.
Right.
But if you have 4 days in a place, how are you going to figure out the spirit of that city? You are not going to go and do it by watching the highlights. For example, I lived in Bombay for a decade, so I have some familiarity with the city. And one of the things which Bombay sort of, gave me a feeling was anything is possible in Bombay, right? Like no matter who you are, where you come from, there is a possibility that you will make it big in Bombay. It doesn't matter what field you are in, right? Does it? You could be an industrialist or you could be a hawker on the railway station selling something. You do not get that if you are a tourist in Bombay because you will spend all your time in South Bombay.
Yeah.
You will see all the highlights, which are worth seeing, by the way. I am not trying to diss that in any manner. And you will eat at certain places. You will take a ride in the local, hopefully off peak hour, and because I don't think peak hour most people will be able to handle.
Yeah.
And you will come out, right? And you will talk about, oh, Bombay's fast, Bombay's chaotic. Okay, sure. All those are true. But it's like trying to peel the layers of an onion. That if you do this, you only peel the first layer.
Hmm.
And it comes down to how many layers of a place can you peel. And in the process, how many layers of yourself can you peel to see who actually you are.
Hmm. Interesting.
So when I think of, my travels over the last decade and a half, some experiences stand out. I think purely from immersion in nature and a visual delight perspective, going to Patagonia and Argentina was one of the best decisions I've taken. It costed me a lot of money back then when I did, and I took 3 weeks off from work thanks to a very generous boss. But going onto a glacier, hiking on a glacier for like a 4 hour time, and walking in the national parks around Patagonia are some of the most beautiful things I have seen, and they just sort of stay with me. This is 2017. I'm talking about it 8 years later,
Hmm.
and this is what I mean when you slow travel and try to absorb places. They stay with you a longer time because the nature of memory is that it decays over time.
Correct.
So if you are slowing down, you have the ability to retain and remember more, thereby having the ability to recall some of those things much later in life.
Hmm.
And what happens is that the memory is like a repeatable thing. The more you refresh it, the more you talk about it, the more you write about it, the more you think about it, it gets stronger.
True.
Yeah, you tend to retain a lot more. However, if you were trying to do 5 countries in 7 days in Western Europe, you will not remember a lot
Yeah.
because there is a limit to how much you can consume and remember.
Yeah.
So for me, Patagonia was great because I was there in Argentina for 3 weeks and we were at least spending 3 to 4 days in each place at the minimum. And that sort of, uh, really cemented my desire to be in nature and spend time in nature. Other trips, Turkey was one of my favorite trips. It was also the first trip I took with two of our friends, and the three of us, spent 2 weeks in Turkey, and we all fell in love with Istanbul. I think it's one of the most eclectic cities out there in every way possible, whether it is food, whether it is culture, whether it is just the architecture of the place, the energy of the place, everything. I think it's one of the most interesting cities I've found. I took a sabbatical in 2018 for about 3 months, and I traveled to Bosnia Herzegovina, Armenia, Georgia, and I spent a month living in the Himalayas. And for me, that was an experiment in both slow living and frugal living, in
Hmm.
the sense that the place I was staying at was like a one-room cottage. It had like a light bulb, a chair, a mattress, books, kind of a thing. That was it. There was nothing else there. and I had almost had no internet to speak of it. And that I think was also very defining experience, because uh, for someone who's used to living in a city and living a fairly fast-paced life, that amount of slowing down really crashes your system for the first couple of days, because it's hard to cope with it. And at the same time, by day 3 or 4, it's very, very start realizing, oh, this is actually not that hard. It's
Mm,
just that it's the initial change which you need to sort of get used to. And of course, when you live there for a month, you end up talking with people, you end up walking with them, you end up exchanging stories, understanding their perspective of life. You stop romanticizing mountain living, because you do not realize how hard it can be to live in the mountains. uh, so those are some of the experiences which really stood out for me, because I think it increasingly shaped my perspective on what is the kind of life I want to design for myself, and what is it that I want to intrinsically, achieve in my life.
mm,
And that may not always be in line with what the world wants to, defines as success slash happiness slash achievement in that sense.
right. Yeah.
So I feel that's why the point about self awareness is important, because that sort of helps you take pause out of this entire rat race madness which we are all running in, and say that, this is what gives me satisfaction, this is what gives me joy, and let me see how can I make it a regular part of my life.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like yeah, and I think listening to you was one of the reasons that got me excited about travel. Like the way you're able to see things that maybe someone would not see because they're rushing through those places and those experiences. And like one thing I love about your podcast, which I will be linking in the show, Postcards from Nowhere, is your show titles, the episode titles. They're so creative. I feel like the way you, like, I remember there was an episode about the story of chai, or the spying history of Wales, and like random facts about the world that just get you so curious about it. And I think one of the, like, building on your travel stories itself, after high school, actually, I decided to take a gap year. And one thing I did was I didn't have a lot of money at that time, so I contacted as many friends as possible, and I decided to just do a round trip of India. From Bombay, I went all the way around. And
Amazing.
the things that I actually remember from that year, I think it was about 7 to 8 months, because I didn't have a job, I didn't have any responsibility. So I was just vagabonding in a lot of ways. But random things, like in Auroville, I remember staying in like a reforestation society. They were trying to reforest 40 acres of land. In Guwahati, I stayed with a friend whose father ran a school, and that was what really inspired my passion for education. If I didn't do that, I probably would not have had a career in education that I'm currently pursuing. And I also realized how rich India is in terms of what you can see and experience that we sometimes don't completely appreciate and realize. We have the hills, we have the beaches, we have such unique travel experiences that would be very hard to find in one country around the world. So within India, Utsav, like, were there any experiences you had that really, sort of shifted your perspective, or not even shifted? I don't think that's the reason we really travel, but something you'd recommend for people that is not really popular that you have experienced yourself.
I feel one of the things I am increasingly seeking as I'm traveling, like India, is trying to get access to artisans and craftsmen.
Hmm.
So I remember I had gone to Kashmir, and I visited a carpet making workshop, and I spoke to the gentleman who runs it, and got to see firsthand how much work does carpet weaving take, and which kind of totally justifies the kind of prices some of these carpets command. But you also get a sense of the fact that more and more of these art forms will disappear over time, because
Hmm.
there's not enough patronage, because there is a cheaper alternative. right? And then it becomes a constant tussle for these artisans to pursue what they enjoy versus having to make a living. And as consumers, it's always a question of to patronize an art versus to buy something cheaper, which does the job as well, but is not handcrafted.
Mm.
So I did the same thing. I was literally 3 weeks ago, I was in Amritsar. And by complete stroke of chance, I realized that Amritsar is the chess making capital of the world.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And
Wow.
most people in Amritsar don't know about it, by the way. And did some digging around and found someone who runs a chess, manufacturing company. And I reached out to him. And he took me around on his bike to all the places where chess pieces were getting handcrafted.
Mm.
Right? And when I'm saying handcrafted, uh, there are the World Championship of Chess, which Gukesh won recently. Most likely, the chessboard he was playing on with the pieces was built in Amritsar.
Wow.
So since 2012, they have been the official supplier of chessboards and chess pieces to the World Championships.
Wow.
They export all over the world. South India is a big market for them. And I also realized that there are people in Amritsar who have only one job. They just handcraft knights,
Wow.
because a knight is the most complex piece to handcarve out of all of them.
Mm.
And they are paid well because they can handcarve knights,
Mhm.
right? And I went to one of the workshops, and that guy literally took a block of wood and crafted a queen for me in 3 minutes.
Wow.
Right? He had a wooden lathe, and he had specifically designed some of his tools to get certain cuts, and he did that, and it blew my mind. I was like, one of these pieces is probably going to end up in the hands of a grandmaster. Uh, Again, not the Amritsar experience most people would go for.
Yeah.
Right? Not to say that you shouldn't go to the Golden Nipple. Of course, you should if you want to. But for me, I think that is one thing which is highly underappreciated, is the sheer diversity of arts and crafts in our country. No matter what you pick up, the sheer diversity of food, I think we are spoiled for choice.
Yeah.
I don't think any country, and I feel that I have seen some significant part of the world, has this much diversity in terms of what you can eat, irrespective of your dietary choices.
Yeah.
And I feel a lifetime is less to see India. And I try to, at least, if I'm making 2 trips a year, I at least try to make sure one of them is in India,
Amazing.
and one of them is abroad. So spend significant amount of time in Himachal, in Kashmir, in Meghalaya, Sikkim, and some other parts. And those have been some of the best memories for me, because it's always difficult to appreciate and understand home when you have it.
Yeah.
And it's easier to find what is not around you is exotic. But if you are willing to go with fresh eyes, then everything is exotic in that sense, because you don't have experience of it.
That's true, yeah. And for anyone interested, I will be linking postcards from nowhere in the show notes. So many stories of Utsav's trips around the world, and it's very hard to condense that in one hour podcast. But I highly recommend following this conversation up with that. But now, Utsav, I wanted to talk to you about content creation in India. It's something that a lot of people are opting for. I think you've had a close sort of vantage point of how it's been growing, because since 2019, I know you've been building your podcast. You've also worked closely with a lot of people associated with podcasting and its rise in India. For instance, the IVM group has some of the best podcasts coming out of the country, and some of the most prolific podcasters building that ecosystem. So through your vantage point as a podcaster and YouTuber and long form writer in India, what are your thoughts on content creation in India and how it has evolved in the last 5 to 8 years, and where you see it going? And maybe you can also tell us a little bit about the 6% Club, along the way.
So I feel a few things which I feel not get discussed enough
Yeah.
is doing content to make money is one of the worst choices you can make.
Mm.
I say that not because of anything, but most people do not understand how content is monetized.
Yeah.
For the average person who's looking to do content, they think advertising money or YouTube partner program is the way to make money. And while it is, but I think when they start realizing how much advertising rates are in India, and when you see the CPM rates,
Yeah.
and you realize you're not paying anything significant, remotely significant, even if you're monetized as a channel, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just talking about YouTube. So my first point is that if you just want to make money, that's the only intent you have, there are way better ways to spend your time and make money, because the amount of effort it takes to do content, and Abhishek, you are not new to this, you have done enough content over the years to know that it is a significant amount of time and investment which someone needs to take, right?
Yeah.
Having said that, the reason to do content has to fundamentally come from what you are interested in.
True.
And I think this is the mistake a lot of people do, who say that, oh, let me become a fashion influencer, because that is, they are the people who are getting the most money from brands, and I can make a living and I can become famous. But two things are missed out here. One, to get to the stage, you have to sustain.
Yeah.
And to sustain, you have to have natural inclination or interest. Because in the initial years, the payoff of content is so poor,
Mm.
that you will lose interest if you are not genuinely interested in the subject.
True. Yeah.
Second is, there is a survivorship bias when people look at influencers, is to say that for every influencer who you see getting a brand deal, there is 1,000 who have not got anything.
Yeah.
And it was very recently that there was a food YouTuber. She had done about 250 videos on her channel, and she actually deleted all of them
Mm.
for 3 years, after 3 years, because she's like, I've not made anything from it.
Yeah.
Right? And I empathize with her so much, because I know how much work she would have put in to get that those 250 videos. I mean, you have put, I think, what, more
Nice.
800, 900 videos on your channel, right? So you know the work it takes to
True.
put even something which people say, oh, what is there? Record it and upload it. I mean, only if it was that easy, everybody would be doing it.
Yeah.
So I feel that you have to do it because it intrinsically interests you, gives you motivation, joy, satisfaction. Yes, there can be payoffs, right? I, for example, have been able to monetize my content, but not in the traditional way.
Yeah.
So, for the fact that I run a podcast, gave me an opportunity to do paid podcasts for other people, where I actually conceptualized, wrote, and recorded podcasts for them. I did one for Omedia Network India, which is a impact venture capital firm, and I got paid for it. I worked with IFP and Spotify to train their as Spotify's new bunch of podcasters. That was
Mm.
again a paid thing for me, and now I also run the 6% Club, where we actually help people with full-time work start content projects on the side, either as a creative outlet or for personal brand building, or even, let's say, helping you generate leads for whatever work you are doing. This is the kind of content and the expertise you can showcase with content.
Mm.
But at any point in time, like even if someone visits our website, you will not see the word monetization mentioned,
Mm.
because I feel if you monetization is what you really want to do, you have to put in an absolutely different kind of work,
Yeah.
an absolutely different kind of commitment, and you at some level have to be slave to the algorithms.
Yeah.
Only then will you come to a space where you could potentially, and there again, no guarantees, you could potentially be making any amount of significant money from content. Globally, there are only 6% of YouTubers who are actually monetized, who even make 1 penny out of their content. So
Yeah.
that just gives you a sense of how skewed the entire creator economy is, which is why more and more creators, if you see today, any large ones you pick anywhere in the world, are now creating alternate avenues of monetization. Something could be as direct as using something like a Patreon to have people support you. Substack, of course, has paid memberships available to people like me who said, okay, now I have expertise in this particular space, and today I run a course which allows me to monetize that expertise indirectly, of course, offering a product or a service.
Yeah.
Right? There are others who, something like AVTV, have their own editing school. More and more large podcasters start building either brands for themselves. Mr. Beast is an example of that globally. MKBHD has recently gotten into his own line of products or something. I don't remember exactly. So I feel that a content creator has to think like an entrepreneur, if that is the intent you have. But I think what most people miss out is the internal journey you take once you become a regular creator, because the sheer amount of discipline you will have to inculcate to be able to do it. So, for example, you had to follow up with me 2 or 3 times
Yeah,
before I said yes for this conversation, and my apologies for that. I was very tied up with things that sort of skipped my mind. But if you hadn't, right, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And this is what most people don't understand about content, right? It is a lot of work, and it also means that you will have to be willing to sacrifice some things.
yeah,
Right? You have to decide for yourself what you are willing to sacrifice to be a content creator. And I feel these are some of the things which I don't think often get talked about when we think of content creation. And by the way, this is true for most places in the world. It's not just true for India. Sure, if you're in the US, maybe advertising pays better. But the fact remains that it is a difficult place to be. But the kind of personal growth, the kind of learning, the kind of connections, the kind of conversations you can have just because you are a creator,
yeah,
I think is such a massive upside if you are someone who wants to be a lifelong learner or someone who wants to continually be a better version of yourself.
yeah. And I think the biggest benefit for me of doing this, Utsav, is to speak to people like you, right? I maybe don't have the opportunity to travel and see so many places, but through your eyes, I think even though this is the first time we're speaking, I feel like I know a little bit of you, because I've consumed hours and hours of videos and thoughts, and those were very personal, intimate sort of, parts of yourself that you were putting out there into the world, and I think there are so many examples in India of people that have taken very unconventional paths to build their content sort of spaces. Like Amit Verma, for instance, is an excellent example
Yeah,
of someone that, has been very steadfast of an approach that he believes in. And I truly believe Seen and Unseen is one of the great podcasts, not just in India,
absolutely.
but around the world.
Yeah,
Like the depth and quality of conversations and even the episode with you, right? I can't imagine how much work and effort it takes to not only do research for each episode, but also put it out there. And also other creators like Cyrus Brocha with Cyrus Says, 1,000 episodes, like
it's
I
insane.
think it's amazing. And I've seen some of your interviews on that platform too, right? Like, and both of them, like Cyrus Brocha and Amit Verma, two very different content creators, but both of them with their own audiences. So you can have an audience in India for a comedy podcast. You can have an audience in India for an in-depth public policy, long form podcast, and they both can exist
Yeah,
simultaneously, right? So I'm very
and
excited. Sorry.
just want to add one thing, that what most people don't understand is that in a country like India, a niche is also millions.
True. Yeah.
Right. So you may say that, oh, this is such a niche, but sure, maybe in a very small country, a niche is very, very niche.
Yeah.
But in India, a niche easily is a few lakhs.
Yeah.
Right. So there is enough space for you to do what you want to do and need to do. Because even if you may feel that everybody around you is doing the same thing, most will not last 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I and like even if you think about the Coldplay experience, like it's an
Hmm.
English band singing in India with people that not a lot of people speak English, but the fact that they were able to sell out a stadium like the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad means that there are 100,000 people that
Yeah.
want to pay for English music, right? And if as a content creator that is your target audience, you know that, and these are not small amounts, 15,000, 10,000 for a ticket. I mean,
Yeah. This is serious money.
that means you do have a consumer base that when you provide them value would be open to engaging. And even in terms of money, right? There was an episode I listened to on the Acquired podcast itself where it was about Taylor Swift's journey as a singer.
Hmm.
And her journey. So they mentioned this statistic that Spotify, for every 1 million streams, can give out around $400 to the top performing artist. So 1 million streams, $400. Again, you'd have to confirm these stats and it must
Sure.
have changed over time. But imagine that for such a global creator, even they cannot like sustainably make money off content. She has like her own touring system, or other brand deals. So I think becoming a more realistic about that journey is, really, really essential. So Utsa, for the last question, again, I would love to talk to you for hours, but just to respect time, I wanted to ask you about recommendations. Like, uh, One thing I've really enjoyed about your work is your appreciation for art and architecture. So if there are artists and structures around the world that you recommend people explore, or maybe a book and film. So if you could just tell me any random recommendations that come off the top of your head, and it could be about travel, it could be about consumer behavior, whatever piques your interest right now.
Okay, lots of recommendations, but I'll give a principle more than a recommendation first. Is to say that if you are interested in something, just go deep into it, irrespective of what the world thinks about it.
Yeah.
Let it be as obscure as it can be, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't fit in in your own definition of who you are. So for my next Substack post, I am trying to create a fantasy world, and the entire post operates in that fantasy world.
Wow.
Okay, I have never done that. I literally had to buy a book, said, okay, how is a fantasy world and a map imagined? How do you name places? How do you draw some of these things? How do you make it look like a map?
Yeah.
It is someone absolutely not who I am, because I literally have started to sketch.
Yeah.
Right? So the first thing is, whatever you like, no matter how obscure, niche it sounds, it doesn't make any sense. Do it, because and I don't remember the person's name, but I would love you for you. I'll send it to you later. There is a person who is able to create art masterpieces by coloring Excel cells.
Wow.
Okay, so this can be as obscure as you go, but when you look at his work, it is so realistic. You would imagine this is actually a painted masterpiece.
Wow.
So first, let that not be a barrier in any way, because that is where some of the most interesting stuff in the world happens. I read this somewhere, I don't remember where, but it says that the world is a collection of other people's passion projects.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, someone decided this is what I want to do, and I just now going to go deep into it. Right. So for me, books, if I would say, just in the space of travel, I would pick authors. So I would pick Pico Iyer. This amazing writing, so reflective. Then Barry Wilson, who unfortunately passed away recently, has written a bunch of books: Arctic Dreams, Horizons, and so many others. There is Robert McFarlane, who writes a lot about nature and the English countryside. Even though I've never been there, his writing is very, very evocative. I also would have to say Alan de Botton's book, The Travel of Art.
Hmm.
No, The Art of Travel, sorry. The Art of Travel is also a great book for you to think and ruminate about how you travel. Uh, when it comes to art and architecture, I don't think I have any formal training or understanding in it, or I don't think I even read a lot of books in it. But what I would encourage you to do is, wherever you are traveling to, try and understand what kind of architecture that place has, because most places will either have one type or a amalgamation of multiple types of architecture, depending on what their history has been, and then try and understand that why this particular thing is the way it is. So while I don't have specific recommendations on these, I would say that go and try and read about why this particular thing is the way it is. Just to give you an example, and I know we are a little short of time, but the entire thing of Jali architecture in India, right, where you go to these temples and palaces, and you realize that you have these, the windows have like a wooden Jali carved out, and that has a lot of logic, because for a hot country like India, when air passes through narrow pores, it actually cools down,
Hmm.
right? So if you are sitting in Rajasthan in a desert palace, it makes so much sense. One second, there are sandstorms, right? Those kind of things actually stop so much of the sand coming into the house. Otherwise, you would go crazy cleaning the house. Correct.
Cool.
Now, those choices, and also sunlight is very harsh, but at the same time, you need natural light, because we did not have other kinds of light earlier
Yeah.
as much. So that filters and reduces the harshness, of the light. Now, these are very, very practical choices. So I think it's if you start thinking about architecture not just as an art, but also as a functionality, as practicality, you'll be able to come with a very different appreciation of both art and architecture. So always trying to understand, why was this particular choice made,
Hmm.
right? It is not just aesthetics. Sometimes it's just aesthetics, of course. But for example, if you look at any if you go to the Taj Mahal, why does the Taj Mahal have huge fountains and gardens in front of them. Why were Mughals obsessed with making gardens
Yeah.
everywhere they went, right? Because if you look at where the Mughals came from, the Mughals came from a desert.
Ah,
And for a desert, the idea of paradise is water, flowers, and gardens.
yeah, yeah, that's
Right?
actually true. Yeah.
Once you understand this, now suddenly every place you go, you are like, yeah, I can see it here. I can see it here. I can see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And that just completely opens a new way of looking at the world and understanding. So I wouldn't recommend books, but just try and apply some of these principles and ask the whys, and you will figure it out.
Amazing, Utsav. Thank you again. This is such an amazing conversation. For the listeners tuning in, I will be linking Postcards from Nowhere, which is this amazing podcast that Utsav has been hosting for quite some time now. There are so many episodes there about over a decade of travel that he has condensed in his own unique way of looking at the world and his travels. I will also be linking other podcasts Utsav has done. There's an amazing one I'd recommend that he's done with Amit Verma, the Seen and Unseen podcast, where it's a deep dive into his perspective on content creation, but also on slow travel and many more stories in that sort of episode. So until next time, thanks again, Utsav, for making time for this.
Thank you, Abhishek. Pleasure
And
being here.
for the listeners tuning in, keep learning and stay tuned for more such stories of amazing people changing the world in their own unique way.